The explosions that rocked the Middle East on June 22, 2025, were not a bolt from the blue. They were honestly the violent culmination of months of escalating hostilities, a deadly drumbeat that just grew louder with each passing week. The region was already a tinderbox, saturated with the fuel of proxy wars, political instability, and deep-seated animosity. The preceding months saw a significant uptick in this shadow conflict. Attacks by Hezbollah, Iran's powerful proxy in Lebanon, became more brazen and frequent along Israel's northern border. These weren't isolated skirmishes, they were calculated provocations really, designed to test Israeli defenses and resolve, creating a constant state of low-grade warfare that frayed nerves and kept the Israel Defense Forces on perpetual high alert. In response, Israel intensified its own long-standing campaign of airstrikes within Syria. These operations, often unacknowledged but widely attributed to Jerusalem, were aimed at disrupting Iranian weapons shipments and dismantling the military infrastructure Tehran was methodically building on Israel's doorstep. Each Israeli strike, while intended to be defensive and preventative, was seen in Tehran as an act of aggression, a direct challenge to its regional influence. This deadly tit-for-tat exchange created a vicious cycle of violence. Each side justified its actions as a necessary response to the other's provocations, pushing the entire region closer to the precipice of a much wider and more direct confrontation. The battlefield was expanding beyond the physical realm into the digital world as well, with both nations trading blows in cyberspace. The digital front of this conflict was just as volatile as the physical one. A series of sophisticated cyber attacks, widely blamed on Iranian state-sponsored actors, targeted critical Israeli infrastructure. These attacks aimed to disrupt everything from water and power grids to transportation networks, sowing chaos and honestly demonstrating a new and alarming capability. Israel, a global leader in cybersecurity, reportedly retaliated in kind, targeting Iranian government and military systems. This clandestine war, fought by anonymous warriors through lines of code, added another layer of complexity and mistrust. It blurred the lines between espionage and outright warfare, making it increasingly difficult for either side to de-escalate without appearing weak or vulnerable to further digital incursions. The most dangerous element, however, was the accelerating pace of Iran's nuclear program. Throughout the spring of 2025, Western intelligence agencies issued increasingly dire warnings. Reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency grew more alarming, suggesting that Iran had resumed enriching uranium to levels perilously close to weapons grade at its heavily fortified underground facilities in Fordow and Natanz. This was the red line for both Israel and the United States. The specter of a nuclear-armed Iran was deemed an existential threat that could not be tolerated. This growing nuclear concern, combined with the relentless proxy violence and cyber warfare, set the stage for a dramatic and decisive intervention that would ultimately draw the United States directly into the conflict. In the pre-dawn hours of June 22, 2025, the shadow war turned into an open and direct conflict. The United States, after months of deliberation and rising alarm, unleashed a massive and precisely targeted military assault on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Codenamed Operation Overwhelming Force, the attack was a stunning display of American air power, designed to cripple Iran's ability to produce a nuclear weapon. Stealthy B-2 Spirit bombers, flying undetected across thousands of miles, were the primary delivery platforms. They were supported by a fleet of unmanned drones and Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from naval assets positioned in the Persian Gulf. The operation marked a significant escalation, representing the first direct U.S. military strikes on Iranian nuclear sites in over 2 decades. The targets were the 3 pillars of Iran's nuclear program: the Fordow fuel enrichment plant buried deep beneath a mountain near Qom, the sprawling Natanz enrichment complex, and the uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. To penetrate the hardened defenses of Fordow, the U.S. Air Force deployed its most powerful conventional weapon for the first time in an operational capacity. At approximately 2:10 a.m. local time, a series of GBU-57A/B massive ordnance penetrators, colloquially known as bunker busters, rained down on the site. These 30,000-pound bombs were engineered specifically to destroy deeply buried targets, and the initial battle damage assessments from satellite imagery showed catastrophic structural failure at the facility's surface and access points. In Washington, the official narrative was one of surgical precision and limited intent. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin characterized the strikes as a necessary defensive action aimed at neutralizing an imminent breakout capability that threatened global security. In a televised address from the White House, President Trump declared the mission a spectacular military success, stating that the targeted nuclear sites had been completely and totally obliterated. He issued a stark warning to Tehran, promising that any retaliation would be met with greater force, a clear signal that the United States was prepared for a wider conflict if provoked. The language was deliberately forceful, intended to re-establish deterrence and project American strength. Iran's immediate public response was a mixture of defiance and downplaying. State media outlets vehemently denied the extent of the damage, claiming that the American attacks had resulted in little to no damage and that crucial nuclear materials had been safely evacuated well in advance. The Atomic Energy Organization of Iran insisted that its nuclear progress will not be stopped. However, reports from local hospitals near Natanz and Isfahan told a different story, with medical staff describing mass trauma events and an influx of casualties in the hours following the strikes. While the true extent of the destruction remained contested, one thing was clear: a threshold had been crossed, and the world held its breath, waiting for Iran's inevitable response. Iran's answer was not long in coming. Within hours of the American strikes, the familiar sound of air raid sirens wailed across Israel, from the bustling metropolis of Tel Aviv to the ancient city of Jerusalem. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps unleashed a furious barrage of ballistic and cruise missiles, a direct and unequivocal act of retaliation. It was a carefully calibrated response, aimed not at the United States military directly, but at its closest and most important ally in the region. Iran launched the attack in two distinct waves, firing at least 27 missiles from launch sites deep within its own territory. This was a clear message: an attack on Iran would be met with an attack on Israel. The targets chosen by Iran were of significant strategic and symbolic value. Missiles were aimed at the heart of Israel's commercial and military infrastructure. Ben Gurion Airport, the nation's primary international gateway, was targeted alongside key military barracks in the Tel Aviv area. The northern port city of Haifa, home to critical naval infrastructure, also came under fire. In a particularly provocative move, missiles were also launched toward Jerusalem, a city holy to billions around the world. Iranian state media framed the assault as a retaliatory, not offensive action, a necessary consequence of American aggression. They simultaneously issued further warnings, stating that this was only the first response and that more severe attacks would follow if hostilities continued. Israel's sophisticated multi-layered air defense network sprang into action. Systems like the famed Iron Dome, designed for short-range rockets, and David Sling for medium-range threats, worked in concert with U.S.-operated Patriot missile batteries to fill the sky with interceptors. The defensive shield performed admirably, neutralizing the majority of the incoming threats before they could reach their targets. The sight of interceptor missiles streaking into the night sky became a terrifyingly familiar spectacle for millions of Israelis huddling in bomb shelters. The system, however, was not infallible. The sheer volume and complexity of the Iranian barrage were designed to overwhelm it, and they partially succeeded in this goal. Despite the high interception rate, at least 8 Iranian missiles managed to breach Israel's defenses and strike their targets. The impact was immediate and chaotic. In the suburbs of Tel Aviv, residential apartment blocks were hit, causing significant structural damage and igniting fires. Key electric substations were destroyed, leading to localized power outages. At Ben Gurion Airport, runways were cratered by the impacts, forcing a complete shutdown of all air traffic and leaving thousands of travelers stranded. While the Israeli military had managed to prevent a much larger catastrophe, the successful strikes demonstrated a sobering reality. Iran's missile capability was potent, accurate, and posed a grave and immediate threat to Israeli civilian life. The direct military exchanges inflicted a heavy toll on civilians in both nations, transforming strategic calculations into raw human suffering. In Israel, the missile barrage caused widespread panic and significant injuries. While the air defense systems prevented a massive death toll, the missiles that got through wreaked havoc. Initial reports from Israeli emergency services confirmed that 86 people were injured, with 12 of them in critical condition, rushed to hospitals for urgent care. Miraculously, no deaths were immediately confirmed, but rescue teams worked frantically through the night, searching through the rubble of damaged buildings in Tel Aviv's suburbs. Dozens of apartment buildings and homes sustained damage, displacing families and shattering their sense of security. Life across Israel ground to a halt. As the missiles fell, the government ordered a nationwide lockdown. Schools and universities were closed, public transportation was suspended, and all non-essential businesses were told to shut down for at least 24 hours. The once bustling streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem fell silent, punctuated only by the intermittent wail of sirens. Ben Gurion Airport's closure severed the country's main link to the outside world, creating a sense of isolation and siege. For millions of Israelis, the night was spent in cramped bomb shelters and reinforced safe rooms, a terrifying reminder of the nation's profound vulnerability in a hostile region. The psychological impact of the attack was as significant as the physical damage. In Iran, the human cost was even more severe, though details remain murky and heavily controlled by the state. While the government was silent on casualties from the U.S. strikes on its nuclear facilities, reports from local hospitals painted a grim picture of overwhelmed emergency rooms. The Iranian Health Ministry, however, released staggering figures related to the broader conflict. It claimed that ongoing Israeli retaliatory strikes in the days leading up to and following the missile exchange had resulted in 430 deaths and over 3,500 injuries. These figures, while unverified by independent sources, highlighted the devastating impact of the escalating violence on the Iranian populace, who were caught between their government's ambitions and the enemy's firepower. The disruption to civilian life in Iran mirrored that in Israel. Major cities were placed on high alert, with a heavy military presence on the streets. The fear of further American or Israeli attacks was palpable. The narrative pushed by state media was one of national unity in the face of foreign aggression, but underlying this was a current of deep anxiety. The economic sanctions, political turmoil, and now the direct threat of war weighed heavily on ordinary Iranians. The U.S. strikes and the subsequent retaliation had dragged the entire population into a conflict with devastating consequences, proving once again that in modern warfare, it is the civilians who inevitably pay the highest price for the decisions of their leaders. The sudden escalation in the Middle East, well, it sent shockwaves across the globe, prompting an immediate and honestly frantic flurry of diplomatic activity. World leaders and international organizations reacted with alarm, recognizing that the conflict could easily spiral into a catastrophic regional war with, global consequences. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was among the first to speak, issuing an impassioned plea for immediate de-escalation and a return to diplomacy. He called on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and step back from the brink, warning that a full-scale war would be a nightmare for the entire world. The UN Security Council was called into an emergency session at Iran's request, becoming the central, albeit divided, forum for international debate. The reaction from major world powers was, frankly, starkly polarized, reflecting existing geopolitical fault lines. Russia and China, longtime allies of Iran, issued a joint statement strongly condemning the U.S. airstrikes. They labeled the attack a grave violation of the UN Charter and international law, and warned that it would lead to severe regional destabilization. Both Moscow and Beijing laid the blame squarely on Washington's aggressive and unilateral actions. In contrast, Western allies of the United States offered more cautious and measured responses. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer described the situation as a dangerous tipping point, while French President Emmanuel Macron urged Iran to cease its retaliation and resume negotiations, immediately convening his own defense council to assess the crisis. Regional powers watched the unfolding events with extreme trepidation. Turkey, a NATO member with complex relationships with both Iran and the West, warned of a catastrophic global escalation and offered to mediate. In the Gulf, Arab states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who view Iran as their primary regional rival, were publicly quiet but privately on high alert. They found themselves in a precarious position, deeply concerned by Iran's nuclear ambitions, but also terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a U.S.-Iran war. There was no public support for the U.S. strikes from these nations, only quiet reports of their air defense systems being placed on the highest level of readiness. Other global players also scrambled to respond. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, balancing delicate ties with all parties, called for restraint and announced that he had spoken directly with Iran's president. New Delhi also moved swiftly to evacuate its diplomatic staff and citizens from Tel Aviv, a clear sign that it viewed the situation as highly volatile. The near-universal message from the international community was one of deep anxiety. While nations were divided on who was to blame, they were united in their fear of what could come next. The urgent calls for diplomacy, however, seemed to fall on deaf ears in Washington, Tehran, and Jerusalem, where the logic of military escalation had taken hold. In the aftermath of the missile exchange, the military chessboard across the Middle East was immediately and dramatically reset. The United States, Israel, and Iran all initiated significant movements of their forces, preparing for the next potential phase of the conflict. The United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, moved swiftly to bolster its posture in the region, signaling its readiness for further hostilities. Additional naval assets, including an aircraft carrier strike group, were ordered to steam toward the Persian Gulf. The Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which is a critical hub for American air operations, was heavily reinforced with additional fighter jets and bombers. American troops stationed in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates were placed on red alert, their bases fortified against potential Iranian attacks. Israel, now facing a direct threat from Iranian territory, shifted its entire defense doctrine into high gear. The Israel Defense Forces Northern Brigades were moved to full alert status, bracing for a potential second front opening up with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israeli intelligence worked around the clock to assess the damage from the Iranian missile strikes and to identify launch sites for potential counterstrikes. During the initial American attacks, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had convened a marathon 5-hour meeting of his security cabinet, which was a clear indication of the gravity of the situation. The Israeli War Cabinet remained in session, debating the scope and timing of its response, caught between the need to restore deterrence and the risk of triggering an even larger war. Iran, in turn, placed its entire armed forces on the highest level of alert. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, the ideological sword and shield of the regime, began moving mobile missile batteries and air defense units to new, concealed locations to protect them from further strikes. IRGC naval units intensified their patrols near the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil is transported. Hardliners within the Iranian government began publicly calling for more aggressive actions, including direct strikes on the American Navy and a complete closure of the strait, a move that would trigger a global economic crisis. This aggressive posturing was echoed by Iran's proxies, with Houthi rebels in Yemen issuing their own threats against American naval forces in the Red Sea. The strategic movements created a tense and highly volatile standoff. The Persian Gulf became crowded with hostile naval forces, and the skies were filled with reconnaissance aircraft from all sides, each watching the other for any sign of impending attack. The military posture of all three main actors was no longer one of deterrence but of active preparation for war. Every troop movement, every naval deployment, and every public statement was scrutinized for its intent. The region was locked in a perilous state of heightened alert, where a single miscalculation, an accidental skirmish, or a political decision could ignite a conflict far beyond what had already occurred. The American airstrikes intended to neutralize Iran's nuclear program may have had the paradoxical effect of making a nuclear-armed Iran more, not less likely. While the attacks caused significant physical damage to key facilities like Fordo and Natanz, military and intelligence analysts warned that this was likely only a temporary setback. The consensus among experts was that the strikes might delay Iran's nuclear timeline by a few years at most, but they would not eliminate it. The knowledge and expertise required to build a weapon cannot be destroyed by bombs. In fact, many feared the attack would only strengthen the resolve of hardliners in Tehran, who have long argued that a nuclear deterrent is the only ultimate guarantee of the regime's survival. This fear was immediately substantiated by Iran's defiant rhetoric. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization declared that the nation's nuclear industry will not be stopped and would be rebuilt with even more advanced technology. More ominously, Iran's foreign minister publicly questioned the value of Tehran remaining a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, hinting that Iran might withdraw from the treaty altogether. Such a move would remove the last vestiges of international oversight and allow Iran to pursue a weapon with no legal constraints. The strikes, therefore, may have pushed Iran from a clandestine program to an overt and accelerated race for the bomb, conducted in secret, dispersed locations invulnerable to conventional attack. The crisis has also reignited fears of a regional nuclear arms race. For years, other powers in the Middle East, most notably Saudi Arabia, have stated that if Iran obtains a nuclear weapon, they will seek to acquire one as well. The American attack and Iran's defiant response have brought this nightmare scenario closer to reality. A Middle East where multiple rival nations possess nuclear weapons would be exponentially more unstable and dangerous than the current landscape. The traditional doctrines of deterrence that kept the peace during the Cold War may not apply in a region rife with proxy conflicts, non-state actors, and deep-seated religious and political animosities. The race to prevent one nation from getting the bomb could inadvertently trigger a domino effect across the region. Fortunately, the immediate aftermath of the strikes did not involve a radiological disaster. Environmental monitoring stations in neighboring Gulf Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, reported no abnormal radiation levels. This suggests that the American strikes were indeed precise, and that either there was little nuclear material present at the targeted sites as Iran claimed, or it was successfully contained during the attack. However, this small piece of good news was overshadowed by the much larger and more terrifying long-term strategic fallout. The nuclear genie, which international diplomacy had struggled for decades to keep in the bottle, was now dangerously close to being released in the world's most volatile region. As the dust settles from the initial exchange of fire, the Middle East stands at a perilous crossroads, with three distinct and dramatically different paths forward. The first, and perhaps most probable in the short term, is a continuation of limited tit-for-tat strikes. In this scenario, Israel would likely conduct a retaliatory strike against Iran, targeting a military or strategic asset of similar value to what was hit in Israel. This could be a missile production facility, an IRGC base, or a key piece of oil infrastructure. Iran would then feel compelled to respond in kind, and the cycle of violence would continue, but remain contained below the threshold of all-out war. This dangerous equilibrium could persist for weeks or months, a war between the wars that becomes the new, terrifying normal. The second and most catastrophic scenario is an escalation into a full-scale regional war. This could be triggered by a miscalculation from either side, a strike that causes unexpectedly high casualties, or an attack on a highly symbolic target. If Israel were to launch a massive counter-assault deep inside Iran, or if Iran were to attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz, the United States would almost certainly be drawn into a direct and sustained conflict. This would quickly expand to engulf the entire region, with fighting erupting in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Such a war would be devastating, causing immense loss of life, creating a massive refugee crisis, and sending the global economy into a deep recession. The third and most hopeful path is a sudden, unexpected move toward a ceasefire and de-escalation. This would require intense and immediate diplomatic intervention from the international community, likely driven by the United Nations, European powers, and perhaps even China and Russia, who have their own interests in regional stability. In this scenario, back-channel communications would be established, and both sides, having demonstrated their capabilities and resolve, might be persuaded to step back from the abyss. A ceasefire would be incredibly fragile, requiring concessions from all parties, but it would offer an off-ramp from the current trajectory of violence. It is a slim hope, but one that diplomats are frantically working to realize behind the scenes. Ultimately, the path taken will depend on the decisions made in the war rooms of Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran in the coming days. The logic of military leaders often favors escalation to restore deterrence, while the political costs of a wider war can push leaders toward restraint. The situation remains fluid and unpredictable. The world watches, hoping for the wisdom of diplomacy to prevail over the drumbeat of war. Each path carries its own profound risks and consequences, and the choice made will define the future of the Middle East and potentially the stability of the entire world for years to come. The events of June 22, 2025, have fundamentally reshaped the strategic landscape of the Middle East, leaving a new and far more dangerous reality in their wake. The most significant takeaway is the overt and direct involvement of the United States. For years, the conflict between Israel and Iran was waged through proxies and in the shadows. With the American airstrikes on Iranian soil, that era is definitively over. Washington has crossed the Rubicon, transforming a regional rivalry into a direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. This new dynamic raises the stakes for every future skirmish, as any attack on Israel could now be interpreted as an attack that demands an American response and vice versa. A second critical lesson is the stark new dimension of risk facing Israel. While the nation has long lived under the threat of rocket attacks from Gaza and Lebanon, The Iranian barrage marked the first time it has faced a large-scale direct missile assault from Iranian territory. The attack demonstrated that Iran's ballistic missile capabilities are not just theoretical, they are real, precise, and capable of penetrating even the most advanced air defense systems in the world. This forces a complete re-evaluation of Israeli national security doctrine. The country is no longer insulated by geography. Its civilian heartland is now within direct reach of its most powerful adversary, creating a new and permanent state of vulnerability. The crisis also served as a sobering confirmation of Iran's military prowess. Beyond its missile technology, Iran's ability to coordinate a complex multi-wave attack and its willingness to absorb a direct American assault and retaliate immediately signal a level of strategic resolve that many had underestimated. The regime has shown that it is not a paper tiger. It is a formidable regional power with the capacity and the will to inflict significant pain on its enemies. This reality complicates any future military calculations and underscores that there is no simple, cost-free military solution to the challenge posed by Iran. Any further conflict will be costly and bloody for all sides involved. Finally, and most urgently, the crisis highlights the desperate and immediate need for robust, creative, and persistent diplomacy. The failure of past diplomatic efforts, including the erosion of the JCPOA, created the vacuum that led to this military confrontation. The exchange of fire has proven that escalation is not a strategy, it is a path to mutual destruction. The only viable way forward is through negotiation, re-establishing channels of communication, finding common ground, and rebuilding a framework for restraining Iran's nuclear program while addressing the security concerns of all parties is now more critical than ever. The alternative, as the world has just witnessed, is a slide into a regional war that no one can truly win.